I do want to know what a convoy element is, but that's not my question. You talked about that rewarding of when the employees got to the next level, that was cheaper to give them the actual program than it was to give them bonuses. Mm-hmm. I was just curious how you kind of sold that. I mean, I guess once it becomes part of the culture, that's what it is. But when it first started and maybe there was some cognizance that they were not getting their bonuses, how did you actually sell that?
Yeah, I would say initially it was the dissonance that was there was more of an earthquake tremor, right? And so you need to support it, right? And you don't do it simply from the learning organization. You actually do it with the leadership, right? The core leadership. So when we were talking about the program, it's called Discover. And when we were talking about the program, we had a town hall meeting where the chairman and senior partner of the U.S. firm of PwC talked about it. And it was front and center as to, it was part of our milestone strategy and how we thought about the fact that we wanted to invest in our people. So the first programs had a greater degree of skepticism, and so they were harder to convince. Today, it's very easy. And so you have to allow, you recognize that any strategy like this is going to be disruptive. And you have to stay with it. And that's where the measurement comes in, right, for it. And we actually have people who are loud voices on the negative side who are now advocates of the program, and they actually come back and support it as a champion for the program. So it just, you have to go through that. You recognize it's there, and you have to be courageous about it. So it's there. The convoy question was simply as if you design to a classroom model and you have 3 people in the room, right? Your goal is everybody, you have to figure out a way to talk to everybody in the room. So some might be more advanced, some might be less advanced, someone might be in the middle. So you sort of create this convoy effect. It says I go to a neutral mixed barometer that says somewhere in the middle of that. So so it's going to be too slow for some, too fast for others. The idea around adaptive learning actually gets you away from that, breaks the convoy, because the goal, the outcome is get to the destination. Some may have the ability to get there faster. So by actually going through the staging of how you actually create those algorithms, the system or technology knows where each individual is, and either you go slower or you go faster through the material. So it breaks that effect. It becomes a more personalized experience. That's what I find fascinating about that technology.
There. So I had a question about the leadership program that you said that you are involved in. So he said something that sparked something else for me as well. Is that leadership program, that was called Discover?
Yes.
Is that through you, or is that through a different organization?
It's through us.
Okay. And so my question is how do you sustain and measure the results of that program?
So it's a great question, and it's so important to actually the success of the program. So today we have about 8,000 individuals that have gone through the program. We measure the success of it at multiple levels. While they're going through the experience, after they complete the experience, and then at intervals that are 3, 9, and 18 months out.
And what are you measuring?
One is, did they actually learn something or have value in the program? As you progress through that, you're measuring, basically, did they take what they learned and actually apply it and turn that into something that for them has become a ritual or more routine? And so because it's leadership based, as part of it is about how do you, how do you create rituals? Mm-hmm. So we want to know how they're doing that. And the reason for it is with a greater need for flexibility in the workplace. How you create that, how do you create balance? That's a very important outcome for us. Other measures are around retention. So are we retaining more of our people? And so we look to study how we're measuring the impact of that. And while I won't share the exact element of that, I will say that the people who go through it and versus the people that didn't go through it, the results are dramatically different.
Gotcha. Thank you.
We're going to put you through your paces, aren't we?
For live in-person training, when you have interactive team exercises, what are best practices for designing and facilitating those exercises?
So be more specific.
The application exercises, after you've taught some concepts, showed some best practices through case studies, let's say, and then you're designing exercises, either breakout groups or for the full group.
Yeah.
Just what are some best practices as you look to design those kind of exercises, and as the trainer, as you're facilitating?
Yeah. So on a day-to-day basis, I don't do a lot of that, but I will give you my perspective on it, because this is what we talk about with our people. One is that we use simulation quite a bit, not just an example, go do this, and then you move on to the next topic. We make sure that from a facilitation standpoint that we actually are connecting the dots. So as part of the thematic design, right, there are these points that are involved with understanding where I am in my progress, and everything is aligned to that. We do the roundtable discussions, the exercises, things like that, but we add to it quite frequently a reflection piece, which is around very simple questions. What did I hear? What did I learn? What does it mean to me? What am I going to do differently? Right? And if we don't get to that level of practical understanding, we know we're not getting far enough to affect human behavior.
Wanted to know, going back to the measurement piece, I got the feeling that most of your measurement tools required self-reporting. Were there any tools in which you engage the managers of the employees to see whether there have been
Absolutely.
concrete?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay.
We engage not only the individual, but the supervisor itself. We actually engage our partners to see if they're seeing that difference. And we also do the elements around focus groups, and we get groups together to do it. So generally, what you think about in terms of robust inquiry at multiple levels, we engage.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks. So you said the average age of employees in your organization is 29?
Yes.
That's truly frightening. But my question is, you had mentioned that millennials seek relevance, and if you don't demonstrate relevance, they're going to tune out. What is the biggest misconception from your standpoint there is about millennials and how they engage with the organization?
Yeah. So there's the negatives you hear about. They're trophy-based, personal recognition. It's about me, and I actually think that's an absolute fallacy. Right. I think they start from a different premise, right? The idea of asking the why I do this, what's in it for me, is really not about their personal desire. I've got to get something out of this personally. They're actually trying to find out whether or not it fits with what they believe, their value structure, and is this something that I want to be associated with? So does it have meaning? So there's that more thoughtful conversation that they want to engage in, which is one piece. The other piece is they want to be associated with their work, right? So the old models which say, you do the work, you give it off to this person, and it goes up to the next person up the line, right? And then you might hear something back about that. They actually like the idea and the opportunity associated with being associated with their work and going with it, progressing with it. So that influences how we think about the way we develop our people, because it's a wonderful way to accelerate talent development, right? And they're very interested in that. And they do look for, you heard that this is, well, they're interested in 2-3 years and then they want to move on, they want to flip and all that stuff, right? They're fascinated with the dimension of insight and perspective, right? Anything that they can get that helps them explore and do that. The other piece is, as a generation I've found, is they're very sensitive to the words that you use and the meaning behind those words. So there's this greater sensitivity of, am I getting the straight answer here? Am I getting the corporate answer here? Right? But because what I want is I want an answer that helps me. Right? Most of their questioning is around helping them understand what it is and how it can benefit their success. Right? Because they're just as eager. In fact, they have more ambition in a lot of cases. And their challenge with them is that, my generation followed more of a linear process, right? You woke up, went to school, you got married, you got a job, and you just kind of stayed with it, right? They want to experience life now. They want all of it now. So part of the challenge to help them is understanding is there's only so many things you can put into the bucket. So how do you choose what you put in and what's appropriate to stay in, and how do you actually create routines that are valuable? So we found that, for example, that our traditional model, if we weren't sensitive to this, was inconsistent because it was asking them to sacrifice things that they were found very, very important. So what's wrong with being able to participate in a marathon? What's wrong with the fact that I need to step out of the building at this time? What's wrong with saying I need a break, and so I don't want to sit at my desk to go do this. I want to sit in the park across the street, right? So, and for some cultures, you're pushing a lot of normative behavior there, and so there's a barrier that says they don't get us. Well, my answer is we don't get them, right? And so we've learned a lot about generational differences, and how you actually become relevant in that context, and it's wonderful.
That sounded a lot like my son. You described him very well.
Yeah. Well, it told me a lot about how to relate to my
I
youngest.
just learned something about my own family.
Good evening. In looking at the L&D career trajectory for L&D professionals who want to take on management or leadership roles within learning, your career example is interesting in your movement back and forth between the line of business and L&D, which clearly built credibility for you as you continue to move up. What other advice would you have in terms of building business acumen for learning leaders in order to demonstrate their preparedness to move further up into a CLO role or Jonathan's role?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things. So if in your specific environment, if there's an opportunity to actually, participate in things that are around various divisional aspects of the environment or the business aspects of the environment, don't approach them as I'm here just as the education person. Approach it as you want to learn about it, right, and engage in it, and develop relationships with people that actually are serviced in that area that you actually can engage in a conversation about, recognizing that your career ambition might be a bit different. You can actually build a lot of credibility by engaging with them and allowing them to understand how important you feel, understanding what they do is. So there's a lot of opportunity just in conversation and relationships that I think allow you to explore. I would also, from my own personal experience, don't be afraid to step into a role that isn't relevant to your background so that you can learn about it, because that expands your perspective. And then I think today it's very easy to go out on the internet. It's very easy to go out and look at sources where you can learn about companies and the environment. So I would just to start to explore those. So if you're in a particular industry, start exploring companies that are in that industry. What do they stand for? How do they look at what they do? What's their competitive advantage? If you're up to it, read their financial statements, because not so much from the standpoint of the numbers, but read management discussion and analysis. Read the president's message, because it tells you a lot about that environment and what they're facing. I would look to anything that's around CEO surveys, things that are being produced and published that isn't necessarily what you would read as a trade, but actually expands your acumen about the forces that are in play. I think those are great things to consider.
So you mentioned global acumen earlier as a part of what it takes to be a successful PwC professional. I work for an intercultural learning organization, so I'm curious to know what you do to develop both individuals and leaders to be successful working across cultures or in a global environment specifically.
We have specific programs in some cases that do that. We actually invest heavily in mobility. So we have people on the go everywhere around the globe to actually get immersed into that culture to start to shape that thinking. We actually also look at mobility and global assignments as global in place. So the opportunity that says, I might not leave my town, my office, but the people who I work with every day now happen to be around our network and our globe. So the idea of how you do that, we look to things that are out there like Culture Wizard, things like that help, and I suspect that's part of your background. But
that's where I work.
Yeah. There was a clue in there, which we use and find that to be very valuable as well.
I think you just earned the Beacon badge.
Yeah. There you go. But anything like that is continuing to explore and associate. And I tell this story, and it's just because it's, again, fascinating. I go to a small hairdresser shop in Passaic, New Jersey, on Monroe Street, and the person who cuts my hair is Colombian and speaks very little English, right? And we have fascinating conversations. Sometimes we actually get a haircut, but but the idea is it's amazing, it's fascinating. Okay? So I go to these different environments to be exposed to it, because you don't have to, be getting a rotational assignment. Invest in it. The United States, and especially in this area, it's so easy, to be exposed to things if you're just willing to go seek it out. So was my first visit, uncomfortable? Absolutely, but I brought somebody along who spoke language who helped me, right? So I recognize that maybe I need a coach or a support to go through this, but I wanted to experience it. And I had a lot of fun in the spring with FIFA soccer, right? Because I was actually invited to, because she had people at the shop, and I was there for when Colombia played. And so it was just a really different environment. So I think you can create them. You don't actually have to be assigned to it. There's just so many opportunities to do it. Even in your firm, right? Our firm is very fascinating from a cultural mindset. Sit down and have lunch with somebody who's very different and listen and explore and listen. And I'll cut this off, but my first experience with it is back in the mid-90s. I had an assignment overseas where I was in Beijing, China for 5 weeks. And my experience going there for 5 weeks was very different because I've been back several times, where I was learning about the culture, because I was reading a little booklet on the plane on my way, right? And I learned all this stuff about the formality around presenting your business card and things like that. And I met the vice chair of the China Institute for CPAs back then, and I did this whole presentation thing, and I bowed a little bit, and he smiled, and he looked at me, and he goes, "We don't bow, it hurts the back." So,
thank you.
So,
Just look at our audience here, and we really are blessed in New York. We have so many different backgrounds. Just looking at our faces, it's great. It's one of the best parts of living and working in New York.
absolutely.
Where's our next question?
Hi.
And then we'll get to Joyce in a minute. Joyce, you're next. Go ahead. She has the microphone, so.
My question is around manager development. I'd love to hear how PwC, how your team gets involved specifically with helping bad managers improve.
Do you have any bad managers at PwC?
So, a couple things. One is we invest a lot in what is appropriate behavior, right? So we scale a lot of that back because of we have feedback loops, so upward feedback loops. We have a global people survey that we follow. So there's a lot of contact with the business that gives us a sense of how we're doing. So at an organizational level, we do that. At an individual level, if we have someone who is seen as having potential, but is underperforming because of the way they relate to the people around them, and they're not serving them well, and they're not serving themselves well, we actually invest in getting them an individual coach to help them see, because part of it is found most of the time with those problems, the person behaviorally just can't see the problem, right? Because they're seeing it through their lens, and it's too difficult. So they actually have to invest in an activity that separates them for a moment so they can step outside of it and be able to look back at it. So we actually invest a lot in helping that as a starting point, because if you can't get there, that clarity, right, you can't move forward. And the other part, we go to an executive coach sometimes because getting coached by somebody who has a similar frame in the context of the environment you're in basically doesn't work either. So we found that sometimes you have to step outside and go to a neutral place. Third element of it is you can't get there unless you can build trust in that conversation.
Joyce, I think this is your moment. Finally.
Thank you. You've made reference to leadership and training leaders, what is leader, what it means to be a leader, and there is a difference between leading and managing. And I was wondering, at what point do you start to develop people? At what level? Do you emphasize training managers? Put it in emphasis. Yeah, sorry.
We actually start day one, right? So in PwC, looking at leadership, right, understanding leadership is actually part of your onboarding experience. Understanding first how you lead yourself, right, and the dimensions of doing that. And part of that is understanding empathy, understanding listening. That goes with it, because we found that if you don't understand early on how to lead yourself, right, you don't have the ability then to demonstrate and be a leader for others. So we start there day one. We believe in a concept that says we want to be known actually as an organization, ultimately as an organization that develops leaders. And we recognize that we develop leadership and leaders at all levels, and we expect it at all levels, right? The reason for that is we break away from the frame that says, if I'm an associate, I'm not a leader, right? And that I take direction from somebody else, right? The idea is that everyone leads, right? You may not have the title, but you lead by influence. You lead because of the way you exhibit our behaviors. You lead because of the value structure and how you engage others, right? So we want that as a starting point. Moving on, then understanding how you lead others, so leading teams and the expectations around that. And then moving on through that is, unless again, part of your measurement to become a manager is that we want to invest in these things before you get there, because it's too late, right? If you don't do it, you're locking yourself into a lot of remediation, which is very, very expensive and slow. When you move beyond that and you start to getting into the manager level and up, leadership becomes about how do you inspire? How do you inspire others to follow you, right? How do you inspire others to grow and actually shape those ideas? So we value that. So that's part of our strategy around how we think about leadership.
Yeah, I have a question about performance management. You know, I'm hearing you speak about all of these millennials and how different they are in learning and how they are acting on the job. And I'm just wondering, do you have different systems in place for evaluating their performance, and how do you do that at PwC?
Yes, we actually just in the middle of actually launching something very different because we completely redesigned it. So the idea of periodic feedback forms, right? Not necessarily relevant, especially to millennials, right? And not necessarily valuable because they're too late. And then moving that into some type of archetype review or process review where you're measuring compensation associated with that. Again, very costly to the organization. So What we have now is one is an organizational philosophy, and we're shifting our culture around this, around the importance of in-the-moment feedback associated with development. Right? If I do something of value, I should be recognized for that, and I should know it. Right? This goes back to your earlier conversation about millennials. Right? If I'm doing something where I need to improve, why not tell me now? So that in the next time I do it, I can do that better. Unlocking how you do that isn't about setting up formal appointments, right? It's about knowing what person's development needs are, what they're focused on, what they'd like to improve in, and actually having conversations. So it's how do you influence the nature of the dialogue and shift that to dialogue so it becomes more developmental. The theming around it is if you can do that, you actually shift dialogue to become very developmental, because very magical, right? Because it's about accelerating development, which is important to the organization. It's about building trust, advancing collaboration, and having greater impact. And those actually play very well at the individual level and at the organizational level. So to do that, we actually launched something called Snapshots, which is an app. It's linked to PwC Professional 5 Dimensions, and it takes a couple minutes to do that basically says, am I underperforming, partially there, at level, partially above, or at the next level? And we've created the framing and the definition around that. And the simple fact is if you're at level, I don't have to write anything, because the assumption is I can't do this unless I've had those conversations with you already, so there's no surprises. So if you're at partially under, there's opportunity to write a comment that says focus on this. If you're partially above, the opportunity to write a comment. If you distinguished yourself, done something exceptional that the organization needs to know about, write it down, make a comment associated with that. So we have focused in on that we want to follow our snapshots, which replaces our periodic feedback form and is linked to advancing these real-time development type conversations.
Thank you.
That's really interesting.
One of the hardest things about coaching, performance feedback, is that people get very defensive. And you mentioned that you develop trust. How do you go about getting that trust so that people can let down their defenses? Because I've got to think that the people that you hire are very high performers, a lot of ego, a lot of drive, and everything else. So there's a clash there in terms of, I'm already there, or I can't do better.
Sure. So our experience has been if you approach that conversation that says, you need a coach, I want to sit down and talk to you about X, and you approach it from the negative, which is you're underperforming, that's a very hard conversation. It's a lot of time and a lot of investment. We approach many of those conversations frequently are around the fact is that what we think of you as a talent, what your opportunity is here, how we see it, and the recognition that we believe at your potential level, your performing level, are disconnected. Let's talk about how we want. So when we have those conversations, the defensiveness exists, right? But you employ 360s and different elements around it, but you actually move through the defensive stage very quickly. Because the whole conversation is that if we didn't value you, we wouldn't actually have this conversation. We'd be having you write your script for your exit interview, right? But we do value, and we want that. So there's a premise associated with it that actually having a coach, getting involved in the feedback, everybody in PwC has a coach, because we believe in that. And that you should be able to go to that coach that says, I was told, I got this feedback, I don't understand it, so help me understand it. Because it's someone who's on your side. That's one level of coaching. We invest in external coaches to help hire performance. Over my career, I've had an executive coach 5 times. Because at different stages, I needed to see the problem differently. And actually, I've asked for it several times. Because I just knew that I needed to step back because I was too focused in the context of my environment that I couldn't see the issue. And so we found if you do it more from the standpoint of potential and value, we're able to defense against fixed. You still got to go through it, but it's fixed.
Something that I had taken away from one of your earlier comments was that you set high standards for your employees, where even the person who just walked in the doors is considered to be a leader.
Yes.
Is that also part of that, that you're always going to have a development need because the organization, really, like you said, really expects a lot of us, and therefore we will be growing in our career, and in order to grow, we need to learn and be challenged and make mistakes.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah, so even for myself, I clearly see areas where I can develop. Because the environment is changing. And if you say, I don't need to develop, I got this, and I'm done, well, you're stagnant. Because you're actually putting a stake in the ground in the world around you. It's basically made out of jello. It's changing. So if you want to get off the bus, fine. But understand that your relevance will continue for sure. So always be aware of that. That's, I think, opens up that conversation and makes things a lot easier.
Can you go for another 5 minutes or so?
Sure. You go for it.
I'll follow you home. Watch out. I think I know where you live now, Passaic, huh? Near Monroe?
Close.
Cover that area.
So I was really intrigued by the way you painted the picture of the millennials and their veracity for learning. I don't know, I guess I'm just wondering, is it your optimistic and vibrant perspective on learning that paints them that way, or are you seeing an evolutionary change in the relationship of employees to the workplace and the corporate, or the growing lack thereof of the corporate structure?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by lack of the corporate structure.
Well, I mean, we don't wear suits anymore. We have corporate casual, and you said you're moving into a place where people are going to be working on their own, and they're going to be like free agents, is what I was understanding. So I guess what I'm saying is that, the corporate, the watch, the 50-year commitment, all that stuff is eroded, and so...
Right. So I don't think it's eroding. I think it's actually responding to and remaining relevant.
Okay. So I guess just to rephrase my question, what I wanted to know is, are the millennials in a different place? Is there a change in the way that we relate to work that's reflected there? Or is this just your...
Yeah, the millennial itself, is, for PwC, because of our scale, it continues to cause us to evolve. And we have to, because you have to understand how you relate to them. So their desires around flexibility. Right? I have things that are very, very important. So earlier we talked about family, career, community, right, and self. Right? Because we're young, we have a lot of people who make a decision to join us, which is probably a self circle. If you look at that sphere, a self-made decision, which probably made with them between them and their professor. At a time, or mom and dad, or significant influence. Right? But as you grow and as you continue to mature, especially between age 25 and 35, life becomes more complex. Naturally becomes more complex. And their desires and their interests is to say, my life is becoming more complex. My career is a part of that, but it's not the only thing. And I'm not willing to make some of the sacrifices that previous generations made, because these things are important to you. Right? Corporate environment is evolving to understand that. Right? If you look at and there's several mega trends that are out there that influence a lot of the thinking, but the dynamics around the nature of the way work is evolving itself, the way we do work. I referred earlier to the fact that when I first started with the firm, I sent a telex overseas. I got a response 5 days later, and I was ecstatic. Because I didn't have to go. I didn't have to fly there. I got a response. Today, if I send out a text message and I don't get a response in a minute, I'm angry, right? Because I didn't get my response, right? So the need to evolve and to have that immediate response and that engagement is driving business to think differently. So it's influencing the nature of technology. Right? Interesting statistic. Right? It took almost 50 years to get 50 million people connected to the telephone. took 85 days to get 50 million people to play the Angry Birds app. So what we think, how we use this technology is, again, evolving the way we do it. We want to compete, right? You think about organizations that have sales forces. Today, with the technology in hand, they're not just a force that sells something. Each one is an information node that's evolving the way the organization thinks. And that's a rapid nature of its response. So I think the coupling of how a younger generation thinks, how they're influencing the way you can think, the ideas that they come to the table with, increases your competitive advantage. So I don't see it as a effective solution of the traditional corporate norms. Some of them are out of date, need to go, because of the nature of the way the nature of the workplace is changing. So I encourage you to be very open to it and understand it, embrace it, because it's fascinating, the ideas of what they. And in my own, as a CLO, I'll reach out to a group of people that have nothing to do with me, and they're a complete different generation. And I'll ask the question that I was asking myself or others, and see what their response is. It's fascinating. So connect. That's the easiest way to do it.
One last question. There's one there in the corner. Two last questions. Go to you, Steve.
Thanks. What do you typically do to reinforce the program's learnings and to help sustain, behavior change? You mentioned that you measure success, 3-9 months later, and I'm sure that helps knowing people you're going to follow up. But what else do you do typically to keep the momentum after they?
So, we engage with the idea of support champions around the program. Right? Get a lot of the voices attached to it. That helps. That creates a sustaining message. And the idea of sustaining is it has to become embedded in the organization. If it stays outside the organization, then the sustainability of it is a check. The other is as we look at it, that people who are following it are rewarded for it. And the idea is to give recognition. Recognition, though, is both monetary and non-monetary. Because we found that there's a lot of gratification where you simply acknowledge the contribution that somebody's made. You acknowledge the change. You acknowledge the response. And it's things like, instead of saying I don't agree, I appreciate your perspective. It's understanding the things we learn about. No, we're not going to do that. It's, gee, that's an interesting point of view, say more about it. So the nature of how you think about it, how you engage, how you give recognition to those ideas. The simple fact is saying thank you. I think leads a lot of opportunity to create sustainability. Because people feel, one, they're being respected. Two, it actually adds greater meaning to what they're doing. They recognize that their time is valuable, and you recognize your time is valuable. The investment you made is valuable. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. You talked about the fallacy of millennials, and we explored that. I wonder if you have any thoughts about the fallacy of things that exist within our industry and things that exist within companies. Like when companies don't get it right, what's going wrong? Where do you see it being off?
Interesting idea. So in addition to being a CLO, I actually have a lot of relationship consultations with clients in different organizations. And it's fascinating, to talk with them about the things that they're doing. And if I was to sort of summarize about the fallacy, one fallacy is that the talent development organization is only engaged at a direct level. So the things that we directly control and influence, that's what we do. Right? I think there's a fallacy associated with that because we have a greater ability to influence versus control. And how things are advancing today, I think enable that. The fallacy that says that I engage from a human resource perspective versus a business perspective, right? I think that's a fallacy as well, because if you're not connected on that side, you're not relevant. So I just think we need to always play and understand both sides of that. As to examples, I think if you start thinking about the talent development more at an enterprise level, right, I think a lot of those fallacies go away. And it's just being courageous enough to step up and have those conversations.
All right, thanks. Our guest. Hold on.
You're at the pinnacle of your career as CLO, and in fact, you're the CLO of the year. Is there an alternate Tom Evans if you had a different profession and you had all the time in the world? Is there some other alternative profession you'd like to be in?
I'm going to actually explore that pretty soon. It's interesting. I don't think there's another profession. I've been in professional service, public sector professional service my entire career. And I'm there because I genuinely believe in it. I do believe that there is a nobility attached to what I do, especially in an organization where you, as a model, you're of service to others. So I think I've found a lot of satisfaction in being in those places. It's interesting, I don't have any desire to teach. So being a teacher, I just don't like to. So I know that's out. So the other thing, though, I found that I actually enjoy a lot is something completely different. It could be a different whole different career. I love working with my hands, getting dirty. I might even just go look at construction type things, where you're building, shaping, engaged. So maybe at my level, my experience level, Habitat for Humanity type activities.
It's great. Yeah, you've announced publicly you'll be retiring in the middle of the year, so you've just given us some insight into what that next chapter might look like, the alternative Tom Evans. So looking at the notes and the questions, Tom, it's clear that you've given so much to our group. I was so excited when you accepted our offer because we know the demands on your time, that you have a really big job, not just as a learning executive, but the leadership, a leader of your organization. You talked about other organizations, you have the mayorship, you also have family. And to give your time and talent so generously and so humbly has really been a remarkable experience for all of us. So thank you very much for sharing your experience and Tom Evans with us.